Welcome to The Imposters. This is a podcast about expertise. Who gets to define it? Who gets recognized as an expert? And whose knowledge is overlooked in humanitarian and development spaces? The Imposters recenters aid around affected communities and lived expertise. In each episode, I speak with refugees, migrants, and Global South practitioners whose expertise is shaped by experience, context, and leadership. These conversations explore what expertise and legitimacy look like in the sector, and how imposter syndrome is often a systemic outcome rather than a personal failure. Each guest joins the Imposters, an archive of lived experience experts in global development. We are a growing network of practitioners committed to elevating lived expertise in humanitarian and development work. I am your host, Laila Raouf. Welcome to the Imposters. All right, today I'm joined by Najae Murray. Najae is a Jamaican education and communications professional whose work sits at the intersection of higher education, public service, and national development. Across his career, he's worked inside education systems, translating policy standards and institutional processes into public understanding, while remaining deeply attentive to questions of equity, access, and youth opportunity. In this conversation, we take a critical look at education systems, not as neutral structures, but as institutions shaped by history, power, and colonial legacies. I'm really excited about today's conversation. So, welcome, Najae. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. What we will see today is my inner nerd coming out as I just reel off random historical facts about Jamaica to support my answers.
No, that's perfect because also in this podcast, I get really nerdy too, because this is like all the topics that I care the most about.
Yes.
Well, I start each conversation kind of the same way with a similar question. So, do you ever feel like an imposter in education or public service spaces? Not necessarily because you lack expertise, clearly, but because of how maybe authority or legitimacy are constructed in these systems.
I definitely do. I can speak for my current job. I got this job when I was 24 years old. So my current role is a director of public relations and communication. And I did my interview online. The thing is that they didn't realize how old I was until the day I got here. So I had to do a lot of catching up. I had to
Mm,
show that yes, I may be young, but I'm also very knowledgeable about the space, about media and communication, about strategic planning. Because one of my focus areas is that I look at communication planning. I hate social media. My social media page itself is done by somebody else. um, so I focus on that part of media and communication, which I made very clear in my interview. But when I came, they were still asking me to do the more creative stuff, which I said, this is not something I'm very strong in, but I can do my best. So one, my age was a factor when I came here. People telling me that, oh, you're the age of my youngest child, or you're the age of my oldest grandchild. So I had to do a lot of navigating around that. Jamaica is a very formal society, so we're a lot of yes sir, no sirs, yes ma'am, no ma'am. So for example, when I was at UCL and I didn't even know the last name of one of my lecturers, I was like, "Who are you? Who are you asking about?" But when you just say Ben, I was like, "Oh, I know who that is," right? But here is very, very formal, and that is coming from also our colonial past, where we had to be sure to call Massa Massa, and the mistress, and there were hierarchies on the plantations as well. So and that spilled over into our everyday working environments. You have some environments now with persons that have gone overseas to study and come back, and they are much more. Those types of leaders are much more laissez-faire in their communication. And I say laissez-faire, I mean less strict on their communication or how they want to be addressed. That's something I had to get used to very quickly. Um, to ensure that one, I have to be very cognizant of my age, and two, that they don't see it as disrespect. Right. So for
mm,
me, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir, just to make it clear. I will oftentimes say, like, Najae is, for me, how I try to change the culture is that I say Najae is fine. Mr. Murray is a man, somewhere. I, Najae, call me by my name. But, some of them don't even want to do that because they don't want you to make the mistake by calling them by their name.
I
Right,
see. So,
right.
does it make you uncomfortable when people call you, like, Mr. Murray, or they call you sir or mister, or is it kind of normal in Jamaican society?
If I come into a space and I say to you that, you don't need to call me Mr. Murray, and you call me, and Najae is fine, and you come to me at one point and say Mr. Murray, I'm going to feel offended because I'm trying to foster an environment where we're able to speak to each other very clearly and honestly and openly, right? And I feel like adding the Mr., adding a qualifier to the title is not something that is necessarily needed, right? For any of the lectures that I had before, I want to foster an environment where people are open and honest and clear in their communication. Yeah.
So, thanks for sharing that. I want to talk about your journey into education and public service. So,
Mhm.
what early experiences shaped your understanding of education as a site of maybe power, not just opportunity?
Mm. There's, I don't want to misquote it, so I really wish I had Googled it. But Marcus Garvey, which was one of the early thinkers coming out of Jamaica, prolific thinkers as a matter of fact, he would have said that education is the key to success. And in Jamaica, that is something that is pounded in your head. Education is the key to success. And even the Ministry of Education, their tagline is every child must learn, every child can learn. Or maybe I have that in the reverse, but is those are the words that are there. So the thing is that you're always very cognizant that the only way for you to succeed in life is for you to be educated. And I can tell you that I didn't start off very well in school academically. I remember being compared to like family members, friends, or cousins a lot, right? Not being able to keep up with them academically until I was the one that they had to keep up with. Shout out to me. But, so from a very early stage, you're told that you need to find some way of, interacting with the world around you. No, but that is also to say that Jamaica, there isn't necessarily always an influence or, obsession with education as to how I took it because, for example, I was talking to somebody the other day and they were talking about building a house. So I said, "Oh, okay, that's nice. So what are you doing? Are you getting some workmen to come and build the house for you?" He says, "Yes," but he's also there helping in the different roles of doing the casting for the houses, doing the plumbing and all that. So I said, "Oh wow, I don't know how to do any one of that." And automatically he says, as a man, you should know how to do these things. And I said, that's a lie because I am employed. Right. So there's also those things where education may be seen as a not a default, but a difficulty in your translation into society. Right. So one being overly educated may be seen as a disadvantage in some aspects. Right. Because a lot of the universities here are as in every country, in every economy, they're churning out students all the time. So, so
So
yeah.
it sounds like what you're saying is that maybe there's pros and cons to having
Mhm,
education, but regardless, education is connected to power in terms of maybe like class or how much you
mhm.
contribute to society. Would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that. And even to say that most of our politicians that we have in parliament have all been, most of them, I won't say all, but most of them have been educated overseas, right? So that has a lot of, for example, our Minister of Finance, she went to Harvard, right? Who else? The former Minister of Finance, he was a Rhodes Scholar and he did his DPhil at Oxford, right? So many of them have international degrees coming back here to say they're contributing to the country. And those are the ones that would have been, seen as the ones to push forward development because they have this overseas qualification. Right.
Mm,
Um, so that can be a sting point for many, but it does contribute to your level in society. Jamaica isn't a very we're colorist society, but I will say somebody said to me the other day, that I'm too dark, and I said, but I'm too educated to care." So, right, it's those type of things that my education has, for me in my mind, removed the barriers that my skin tone would have played, right? But I know that in other contexts that's not the case. Yeah.
totally. I'm very interested to hear about your approach and how you integrate your lived experience into your research.
I just wanted to share that when I came, I was very conscious because I wrote all of my essays about Jamaica, and I said, "Am I limiting myself?" But I had to come to terms with. I said, "But I'm here for development of my country, and if I'm not using this opportunity to research my country in an objective environment, then what am I doing?" Right, so it's
Yeah.
very important for me to come and write and read more about Jamaica. And there was one day I went in the Senate House Library and I saw a crest rather. I said, but that's my university's crest. And that again goes back to the linking of the colonialities, because my university, University of the West Indies, started as an arm of the University of London, right?
Really?
Exactly.
I didn't know that. Oh my gosh.
Exactly. So when I saw the crest, I was like, I know that. And then I saw like, different leaders coming out of the institution, from the first graduating class and stuff like that being presented in Senate House Library. I didn't expect that. But yes, that was just one thing about researching my own context.
No, that's really fair. When did you, like, maybe first become aware that education systems in post-colonial contexts are not neutral and maybe historically produced?
When I was in sixth form, we were doing sociology. It was a topic was Marxism, and we spoke about education being the opiate of the masses, coming from Karl Marx, and that is when my everything turned on in my brain. Alright, because I didn't just see religion being as the opiate of the masses. I saw everything, even when we talk about functionalism, how all parts of society work together, right? But is it constraining or is it empowering? Right? You sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you may feel that you're in a state of empowerment, but you're really constraining somebody else to be a part of that empowerment. You understand? So that is a part of that's when my brain turned on because I started looking at not just religion but every system that I was a part of. How is school contributing? But how is school fostering the power shift and equity? How is my church doing so? How is my family doing so? Right? How are all these institutions that I'm a part of affecting me as a individual and individuals around me? Right? How are they contributing to the development of my family, of the economy? Right? So those are things that I consider when I look at power, and how power is manifested through our education.
Mm. And, you've been working in higher education specifically for some time now. Do you have any thoughts about how maybe colonial legacies have shaped what is considered quality or standard or credibility in higher education today?
Yes, just to note the one of the largest institutions that we have here, that is the University of the West Indies. The first chancellor of that university was actually the aunt of Queen Elizabeth II, and
Oh,
her name is
wow.
Princess Bliss, right? And,
A
so
direct connection.
exactly. It's a direct connection to how, our institutions are formed based upon colonial legacies. Um, Additionally, we had used to do the English exams here in Jamaica. I think it's called the GCSEs. So many of the older generation, they would have done those exams, and now we have CXCs. Some people still do feel like the GCSEs better prepared them for life, right? That the quality that they had to go through, the rigor that they had to go through for GCSEs is nothing compared to what we do now for CXC. And sometimes I have heard comments like that in the workplace, right? Where, back in my day when we did GCSE, it was this type of we did this and we did that, right? But you guys are just doing this now, right?
Yeah.
So there's oftentimes direct comparison between what happened before and what happens now, and the data is really truly there to show that the quality in what we're learning now or how we're going about learning has improved, right, from what we did before. And I think a lot of Jamaicans fail to understand that when it comes on to the history of our independence, is that, or even coming from emancipation from slavery, there are economic reasons why they ended slavery. They couldn't afford any more rebellions, right? So it's not saying that it wasn't fought for. Obviously, it was fought for through our national heroes, for example, like Sam Sharp, Nanny of the Maroons, and later on Paul Bogle. Um, is that what they don't recognize is that the institutions that we were left with. So when we got independence, we had to now figure out our own hospitals, we had to figure out our own education. So the British Empire got up and said, "You want a problem to deal with? Here you go," and they left. leaving us to fix it. Not to say that there wasn't aid involved or there wasn't some guidance involved. Not saying that at all. But I'm saying that the bulk of it was left for us here to figure out with limited
Sure.
resources, having just been robbed for 400 years of the resources of the island that were placed on, right? And the indigenous people that they killed off. So,
Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know if you came across this in our program, but I found it really interesting to learn about the connections between the education industry and colonialism in general, and that when the major powers were setting up base or essentially starting to colonize areas, they first set up schools. And schools and universities were kind of the first step to colonizing an area. And from there, they set standards, and that's when they started like dividing people and creating like an administrative class, an educated class that was more tied to Europe versus like the masses. And I always thought that was really interesting because a lot of us think that education is inherently good, and it is good and it does bring opportunity, but there is like a dark history there
Mhm.
that we need to talk about.
That's so true. And something funny I came across the other day, a colleague of mine and I were talking, and we're saying that why is it that all of the high schools that are owned by churches, a lot of the high schools in Jamaica are owned by churches, but why is it that these schools are on hills? Why are they like so far away, tucked away into the interior of the island? For example, even my high school was on the interior of the island. And then I went to Frankfurt High School. Even my sister's high schools in the interior of the island. Most of these older schools are there. And we said, why? But we said the reason why is because the flatlands were needed for farming of the sugarcane, right? So the powers that be had no problem giving us the hills to go put a school on. Right? That was out of sight, out of mind. Um, I think one of the school's mottos is a school that is set up on a hill cannot be missed. Right? Because it's on a hill tucked away somewhere, but they say that they're so good that they cannot be missed. Which is so I don't think it's true because it's very far away from society.
That's interesting. You went a different direction with that, but what you said reminded me of I remember reading in some sources that not in Jamaica, but in the African continent, the first people to introduce like the concept of teacher training or capacity development was missionaries in the African continent, European missionaries that came and provided education training to people there, but it was through missionary work. And I thought
Yes.
that was interesting too, and missionary work obviously has some, like, ties into European and colonial powers as well. Anyway, all of it to say we could probably come up with a million examples of this, but there are some deep roots there to interrogate when you're trying to, like, analyze education systems. Alright, I'll keep us going. So I wanna, talk about some more uplifting topics, and your work is really interesting because you work in higher education and you're interested in, like, equity-oriented work. So, from your experience, what does it mean to do equity oriented or reform minded work within institutions that, might have these legacies of colonialism at its, foundation or in its history?
So one of the things is that I believe Jamaicans don't have is access to the information that they require to propel themselves forward. I recall we at my job we do this thing called a public education school tour, where we go around to different schools and inform them of their responsibility of choosing an institution that is of quality. And when I say of quality, I mean being quality assured by accrediting body, right? I remember this conversation with a young lady that she said she doesn't know what she wants to do with her life. Her next option is after she leaves high school is to go and work on a cruise ship as a waiter. So I said, okay, growing up for me, you're told you need to find a career path. And,
Yeah.
you got to be a doctor, you got to be a lawyer, you got to be a teacher, one of those major ones. And if you may fall, you aim for the moon and fall on a star, something of that sort. Um, but this was her plan. This was her plan leaving high school. So I said to her, "But what is there anything else that you're interested in?" And she says, "No." So I said, what subjects are you doing at school now?" She says she's doing biology, math, physical education, English language, and something else. It was 5 subjects that she had mentioned. So I said, "Of those 5 subjects, what do you like?" "I like biology and I like physical education." So I said, "Have you ever considered the career path of a physical therapist?" She says, "No, what's that?" Right? So that goes to show you that she nor her members of her school or even the guidance counselors aren't really sure how to guide these children properly, right, into another path. They say they want to do waitering, sure, no problem. But we haven't shown them like there are other possibilities out there, right? And me, I would say for myself, coming back for my first time leaving home for so long, right? My worldview or my vision of what I want for myself has expanded even further, right?
Mm.
I used to say I wanted to be a permanent secretary in a ministry of government here, but no, I said, I want to go travel the world and be a traveling educator somewhere. I want to do other things in
I
my
wanna
life.
be a cheating scholar.
That too, exactly, right? I know again it's about access to information because how I even applied for Chevening is that I saw a friend um who was leaving for Chevening in the supermarket and she says, "You should apply." I said, "Sure." But why was I so confident in applying is because I know I had access to the information, right? So I think one of the things that we're failing at as a country is letting students know that there are possibilities beyond their wildest dreams out there. And, these are ways you can get to do so. We have, for example, the Student Loan Bureau. And I've heard persons say that they don't want to take the student loan for them to pursue their education. I think that may be because of the horror stories that people may see or hear from international media about how international students in America, or students in America rather, are dealing with these types of financial constraints as it relates to education. But I took student loan for my first 2 degrees, and I don't even the payment that is coming out of my account now, I don't even notice it, right? Because I have used my 2 degrees as my foundation, right, for me to be able to go and seek employment in a gainful way, right? And then give myself the opportunity to be paid on student leave while I was away on evening, right? So, but what was that? It was access to information, right?
Mm.
I would say that I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and nobody else was there to tell me this information. I had to figure it out. But now that I know, I've ensured that my other family members who have come before me in my generation, that most of them are in school, right? I've tried my best to ensure that even if they don't want to go to school, I encourage them to get some form of post-secondary qualification. And if they don't want to do that, I can always say I'm paid to give my best advice. And I'm just advising you, and this is what I would do, right? Um, but as a lack of information, I think, is what is preventing growth from really propelling forward in our country.
Is that why you're so interested in communications?
I fell into communication. I really wanted to be a lawyer.
Really?
Yes.
I could see
Um,
that as well.
thank you, thank you. But I fell into communication. To be honest, at the first year of my degree, I didn't know what I was doing until I got to my second year, where I had classes like that said public relations and advertising. I said, "Oh, that makes sense." But um, but yeah, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. But I'm happy that I found myself in a space where I'm not able to just work in one industry, but across different industries because I'm communicating their policies and procedures to the public. And because of that, I was able to move from national security over to education seamlessly because it is the same tenets of communication that I'm using to communicate to the public of Jamaica about the policies and procedures of the government.
Where do you see room for, like, reimagining or change in terms of
Mhm.
equity in higher education? And where do you think the system is, like, resisting change?
Hmm. I wouldn't say the system is. There's something I learned in the program. There's a difference between um, implementation of a policy and the actual execution of the policy, right? Where because Jamaica is not short on policies. If you need a policy, trust me, it is here somewhere. We have it. We have it, but where we fall short is the execution of the policy or the interpretation of the policy rather. Right. So one school may think that, this is what I need to do to achieve the sixth form pathway program that we have here. While another school may say, um, because of the resources that I have, this is how I am interpreting the policy. I can't tell them that they're wrong, right? Because while you can give clear instructions, interpretation is key. And I think there's not a struggle for change. I think Jamaica really just want to transform, right? and there are steps that the government has put in place to enable this transformation or to facilitate this transformation. However, it lies in our interpretation of what we're doing. I think that is our challenge. And that is where I come in, I think, as a communicator, to ensure that what we are sharing with our stakeholders is being interpreted properly for them to be able to take it to their organization and implement it. Right?
No, that's wonderful. And on the topic of like reimagining or
Hmm.
improving our education systems, I know your research as a cheapening scholar was, it kind of interrogated some of the colonial legacies to education in Jamaica for youth, specifically TVET education in Jamaica. So could you talk a little bit about like how that theory kind of intersected with your findings?
Right. So the theory was cultural political economy. And when I was doing history in high school, I remember every time we were writing an essay, we were always told to look at it from the cultural, the political, the social, the political, and the economy. Right. So when I saw that theory, I was like, that makes so much sense.
It's everything.
Because it captures everything, right? And TVET has oftentimes been spoken about as having a stigma in Jamaica. TVET, TVET rather, definitely does have a stigma um, that is perpetuated by colonial legacies because back in the day, it was the person who couldn't afford to go to school or a person that wasn't necessarily smart enough academically that would be forced into a pathway of TVET or dropped out of school to be learn to become learn to become a welder, learn to become a car mechanic and stuff like that. Right. So what we're doing in Jamaica now is trying to formalize those systems by allowing persons to get a certification in those systems or get a certifications in those areas rather. Right. So I think for cultural political economy, I was able to identify that yes, there's indeed a stigma, uh, um, and yes, there are economic implications for Tibet, and Tibet does allow for sustainable development. We've seen some of our largest countries, developing countries rather, for example, like Singapore, that would have developed or built out a wide skills training environment, right? Whereas we are working towards that, and we've seen where it has benefited their economy, right? And as it relates to political lineage as well, we're seeing where politically that two different sides of the spectrum may have different views as to how TVET should be implemented. And what I can say is that I like continuity in government because I believe that's how policies are best implemented, right? When you
Mm,
have more constant mindset, right? Not to say that we should have an authoritarian government that rules us forever and ever, but she
right.
said we should pick
It
a
needs
policy.
time to cook.
Exactly, it needs time to develop over. Exactly, I like that. It needs time to cook. So I think politically, you may see one party swing to another side as relates to TVET or education in general. And what I can say is that coming out of the research, one of the interviews that I did, here I was speaking because I was very mindful of my positionality, coming as somebody from a middle class background who, this is my third degree I'm doing now, and I'm working for the government. My job title sounds fancy, right? I was very mindful about those things
Right.
going into interviews. And then one young man at the end of his interview said to me how TVET has changed his life, right? And how no, that TVET has changed his life. He's now an instructor at one of the institutions. And then he said to me, having heard all of what I've said, would you want to come and do a skill or learn to get a certification? Right. And that I thought was very beautiful because I'm saying to myself, why would you ask me that? Because obviously I don't need a skill. But at the end of the day, probably everybody needs to have some form of vocational skills. Everybody needs to learn how to cook. Right. And I think we did stop thinking about it as at a high level of, you get a certification. No, you're learning life skills. Right. That teacher provides as well. One of the other young ladies, she was doing culinary arts and she expressed that in her culinary arts program she also learned how to do other things like video editing, and how to like put our document together to show how she's planning her menu and stuff like that. So these are other skills you're building on for your TV, so you can so you can market yourself, right, to your employer, or even market yourself to have your own business, right? So we need to stop seeing it as one singular thing, as a skill as a skill you're just going there to learn to cook. No, you're going there to learn skills as well. In that way, I think cultural political economy really encapsulated the entire definition of TVET in Jamaica and how the youth expression really needs to be represented in TVET. And not to say that it isn't, but I think it needs to be louder, right? We need to hear that we need to hear of these stories of people benefiting from TVET. So families can say, oh, but you can go and do a skill, right? And let us not see it as a second option, right? It is an option. You can either do a skill or you can go the academic road. Right? So that in itself removes a stigma and presents it as an option.
Totally. I mean, especially like considering the challenges we're facing globally with access to education and access to higher education, I think there's, like, no room for stigmas at this
Hmm.
point. Like, if we're gonna crawl ourselves out of this mess, like, we need to get over these stigmas and these, like, perceived hierarchies of what is, like, considered good and quality education. Of course, we need to have, like, standards for our
Hmm.
education and make sure people are learning and growing and benefiting, but, having a stigma against vocational training is not helpful for the nation, it's not helpful for the economy, and it's not helpful for those youth who are choosing that path. So I really appreciated, because I did skim your research, and I appreciated how yours was grounded in lived experience. And I'm happy that that seems to be kind of a trend that research is going to kind of ground it in lived experience so we can actually understand how people feel about these topics. Otherwise, you'll just believe the assumption that like no youth are interested in TVET. But your dissertation proved that I remember I read like one quote that it was like a source of pride to like use their hands and like to build something that they can leave at the end of the day having created something. And even reading those notes, that data from your research immediately changed my perception of TVET,
Hmm.
honestly, in just, like, a few minutes of reading it. I was like, "Huh, I hadn't thought about it that way," and that's, like, a really interesting perspective. So, anyway, all to say, like, the research was awesome, and I enjoyed reading it. It's so interesting and unique, and I love that you're, like, researching something that's very close to, like, your profession and your home and, like, your world, even though you're, obviously aware of your positionality and you were really careful about that, but it's, like, really nice to see work grounded in lived experience. But enough about complimenting you. I just have a couple more questions before we close out this episode, but what advice do you have? So what would you want early career professionals working in education or policy or public service to know about their voice, their authority, and their impact?
Well, I had to learn very early on that listening was more important than speaking. um, because I left university being very bright eyed, very bright, um, g- very aware of the systems that I'll be going into. But because of all that perceived knowledge I had before, when I just entered, I wasn't listening. But is when I started to listen is when I actually started to learn how to do my job properly. And while there's going to be room for improvement and change, you have to give it time to happen. I have recognized this is my fourth year at the UCJ, and I realized that this was the only year that I've been able to suggest a topic for an event we have. But that took years of me building trust with them to say, okay, he's actually saying something that makes sense this time around. Let us go with it. Right?
Yeah.
Think for early career professional, it is good for you to start off listening. It is good for you to start off reading the policies and procedures. Not just practicing for the interview, but when you get there, get into job, right? Read everything. I believe in keeping an empty inbox. So I have zero emails
Oh,
unread because
you're one of those people who moves all their emails?
I read all my email. Right? Because I need to be aware of what is happening around me. And again, when I started this job, very energetic, ready to take on role, and I realized, oh, I have to slow down. I'm at a point now in my career where I've decided not to push forward, not to push backward, not to go up or down, but to just stand still and hoping that what my next pathway comes my way, I will have skills to move forward. For right now, I'm standing still. And I encourage persons when they just start working, to stand still for a moment and appreciate where you are and then move forward when the opportunity presents itself. You don't have to create every opportunity.
That's really good advice, and that honestly just makes me feel instantly relaxed because I feel like I'm always chasing opportunities and always thinking about the next step, but You're
Mm-hmm.
right, just, like, relax, appreciate what you have some gratitude, and just, like, listen and observe and learn while you
Mm-hmm.
are where you are. That's really nice. So, what is next for you? I know you're back in Jamaica. Is there
Mm-hmm.
any, like, exciting work or projects that you'd like to share?
As I said, I went on study leave. So when I came back, I just reacclimatized to my job. I'm really working on getting back to my job.
Lots of
We
listening.
Yeah, lots of listening. When I came back here, I was like, yes, fresh off the boat, ready to go and improve lives. And then I was stopped. Right? I'm giving myself 6 months to figure out what this is and then moving on. So right now, as it relates to projects, is just trying my best to reacclimatize myself to my life back at home. Um Getting steady in my job, participate in my church, more stuff like that. Try to reintegrate with my friends because I left my friends for a year and I came back. They're different people, or I am different. Somebody is different, right? So
Something's different here.
something is different. I'm really and truly, it's some personal introspection I'm going through now because I will say that my time in London was the best year of my life. Um,
Really?
it really was. It really was. So it is time for me to reacclimatize to what I had left, and getting used to that again. Yes.
Well, I think, like, if you follow your own advice, which is just to be patient and to wait and listen, the opportunity is gonna present itself, and you're gonna start reapplying all of the knowledge that you gained as a Achieving Scholar and at UCL into your university. I have no doubt.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, more flattering. I love it.
Yeah, that's the point of this podcast is I just pick cool people and I flatter them for an hour. Well, if anyone was interested in maybe collaborating or reaching out, how can people follow your work?
Well, you can follow my LinkedIn. That's my name. It's Najae Murray, right? And you see the things that I'm interested in. Currently, I think I want to do another piece of research.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So I want to do a comparative analysis between Jamaica and Nigeria, or small island developing states versus larger developing countries like India, about what happens when the aid leaves. Right. So for example, when USAID had shut down, schools in Jamaica would have shut down. Whole organizations were impacted. Like big part budget had just disappeared. Right. But how have we bounced back from that? Have we bounced back any at all? What has happened since then? Is a piece of research I think I'm interested in doing next.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be interested in, like, reading your research. I know that's, like, at this point in time, it's time to start reflecting on how big the impact has been. Um,
Mhm.
Also, just, like, on a lighter side, I love that you pulled up your notes in your phone to read about your, like, really intense research ideas. That's how I am too. If you look into my notes on my phone, it's, like, a bunch of weird ideas that I have, like, including including doing this podcast. It started off as, like, a note, a random intrusive thought that I had, and I wrote it down, and I couldn't let it go. But well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and to, like, laugh and talk about your work in higher education and communications and your really interesting research. And I'm really thankful that you were able to meet with me today and have this conversation.
I'm happy to talk. I talk a lot, right? So I'm always happy to talk. And anytime I hope to come back again.
So, Najae, thank you for bringing such clarity and honesty into this conversation. Your reflections remind us that education systems don't just distribute opportunity, they can also reproduce power, and that working towards equity often means questioning the very foundations we've asked to uphold. So, I'm very grateful to welcome you to the Imposter Roster. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about today's conversation, visit theimposters.org, where you can explore episode resources and browse the wider archive of lived experience experts. Tune in to The Imposters wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Lila Raouf. Thanks so much for listening.